Hello and welcome back to what should be the last of the special episodes of Brigador. We are going through the equipment list. We're halfway through. We're going to finish it off. Cannon, 76mm HE, Preacher. Lacks the punch of its bigger brothers, but the significantly smaller shells allow for a much faster cycle rate, an ideal choice for dealing with light armor and infantry formations. Not much more to say about the Preacher, other than that it works. Cannon, 60mm Vortex, Jericho. This is an ingenious creation of a ballistic weapon without the normally immense mass requirements of ammunition. The idea behind Vortex cannons is quite old, but the destructive potential they offered was never enough to merit serious development, at least not by the military. The Spacers not only proved the theory's combat efficacy, but adapted Vortex cannons as their primary non-photonic weapon type. The drawback is that they're difficult to aim. Vortex muzzle velocity is much lower than conventional munitions, and the projectiles themselves are invisible to the naked eye. Jerichos have real trouble against shield emitters to boot, but will annihilate most fortifications and unshielded targets in a single blow. Even the lighter Jericho mounts common among Arlos will open up a Tobruk like a tin can. It's obvious their scientists and engineers were spurred by mass reactant concerns, but Spacers pursue too many unusual lines of investigation for simple pragmatism. I suspect there's a continuing desire to show superiority over dirt eaters as well, though I can't be sure. Chain gun, 20mm HE, Belter. If unsure what you're up against, Belter's your man. Shells are just big enough to worry heavies, and whatever explosive the design bureaus snuck in also causes problems for hard shields. The explosive comp makes for poor penetration though, so don't expect to punch through anything thicker than a Corvid shanty. Chain gun, 27mm AP, Stutter. The 27mm Stutter is an anti-aircraft weapon that's been seeing a lot more action against ground units. High maneuverability vehicles, light mechs in particular, benefit well from the burst fire configuration. The Belter is great, but only the real pros can stay zeroed on a target while hauling ass. Always a good idea in a Sparrow or Marlow. Most pilots do much better with shoot and scoot, and with its cycle time, the Stutter's a natural fit for it. I don't know the particular metal composition for the rounds this thing eats. I just know it's some special config that'll punch through concrete and steel like a railgun. Downside is hard shields have a much easier time with deflection, so keep that in mind. Mortar, 120mm HE, Metronome. Spacers don't often resort to indirect fire, as they seem to prefer knife fighting engagements, where opponents are within a mile of each other. Despite this, their skill with manufacturing and deploying artillery remains exemplary. Unlike the Harvester, Metronome artillery is precision at range. The breach and loading mechanisms here are a masterwork of Spacer engineering, allowing for a prodigious 1 round per second firing rate. But what I'm really astonished with are the Spacer systems for range finding, guidance, and coordinate relay that enable target acquisition to keep pace. It is this computer-assisted aiming that puts Spacer artillery miles ahead of our own, while also preventing our effective deployment of captured metronomes. Chemical Projector, 132mm, Chuffer. A cocktail of reactants and the infamous Tabarau are packed into agitator shells, which tumble end over end en route to the target. The NEP forswore usage of the weapon after what happened in Moerbeke during the Troubles, but I've seen caches of ammunition along with both Chuffer and Plowman launchers at more than one district HQ. After the Moerbeke rain, the lead scientist and his assistants were found dumped by the outer core gates, with their insides turned to paste, having been forced to breathe and ingest the mixture respectively. The militants who captured them apparently had a flair for poetic justice. Laser, 12 megawatt discharge, broiler. It's a laser shotgun. Railgun, 12 millimeter Sabo, Galena. The original spec for the Galena called for a scaled down version of the Zeus, but early development showed the idea was impracticable. That process, however, led the design bureau to an idea for a radically different weapon. Unwilling to risk the War Council turning down their proposal, the lead engineers falsified successful testing rounds for the Zeus variant, while racing to develop their own concept in secret. When a surprise inspection revealed the deceit, the council slated the entire bureau staff for rotation and threatened the bureau chief with a sedition charge. But all that was changed to a mild reprimand once the new weapon actually hit field testing. The Galena is named for the relentless cyclic rate of the gun, unparalleled for a Lorentz-type weapon. While still high maintenance, it doesn't suffer the fouling issues endemic to propellant-based munitions, and its conductive rails are small enough to be field-swapped. Frankly, the War Council was so fixated on the existing implementation of their darling Zeus that without the ruse, I don't think the Galena variant would ever have been greenlit. Of course, that didn't stop the Council from taking full credit for the weapon's inception once it was deployed. Cannon, 105mm HE, Abbott. The venerable Abbott, pre-colony tech that hasn't changed in over a century. Sure, the munitions have evolved, and the exact meta composition might be a bit different now, but along with the Maidois and the Koenig, this weapon is a perfect feat of engineering. Put 10,000 rounds through it, and your shots will still land just about where you aim. Age and reliability mean you can travel to just about any colonized world and find an Abbott perched off some vehicle or another. It's a steadfast weapon that's good in just about any situation. Cannon, 88mm Airburst, Archie. The Corvid knack for chaotic firepower is exemplified by their beloved Archie. Airburst ordnance set to a dangerously short fuse creates a field of shrapnel in front of the firing vehicle. Shield emitters are rapidly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of metal, while most light and improvisational armor will cave in or simply shred to pieces. Since the Archie was designed for engagements within 100 meters, accuracy is a non-issue. Weight normally dedicated to elongating the barrel is instead spent creating a much thicker one, allowing for greater pressures to be exerted without compromising the weapon's structural integrity. It's why an Archie is able to sustain such a withering rate of fire at that large a caliber, albeit inaccurately. The end result is loud, messy, and effective, an apt metaphor for the Corvids themselves. Ironically, the Archie also happens to be one of the most efficient counters to Corvid equipment, provided you can find a loyalist commander adventurous enough to mount salvaged weaponry. Chain gun, 40mm HEDP, Duchess. The Duchess's moniker was originally pejorative in nature, stemming from its almost universal fouling issues and temperamentality. Eventually convinced it wasn't a case of user error, a small portion of the original development team returned to iterating on the weapon, at one point even embedding with a division of Duchess mounting broadswords and Swedes. Prickly as they can be at the design bureau, the design bureau takes pride in its work, and after a dozen or so iterations across 4 years, they had managed to turn the NEP's least reliable weapon into a thoroughly reliable mainstay. Firing 40mm HEDP rounds at just over 2 per second, the Duchess combines a cannon's firepower with an MG's suppressive capability. Mounting a pair of the chain guns for asynchronous firing is a favorite tactic among Tinker drivers, and apparently some find the continuous vibration highly stimulating, though I cannot personally vouch for this. Chain gun, 14mm HE caseless, Banshee. It's rare to find large caliber MGs configured for caseless ammunition, though unsurprising here given the Spacer's extreme sensitivity to mass transport and expenditure. Banshee rounds are smaller than you'd expect for the weight class, but travel inordinately fast. Spacer chemistry borders on the preternatural, given what I've seen of their propellant. Possessing both tremendous rate of fire and projectile velocity, the Banshee makes for an ideal counter to scouts and other vehicles relying on combat maneuverability. The comparatively small caliber explosive rounds prevent overpenetration against lighter armor to ensure target destruction. Siege Mortar, 200mm HE, Balau. Pride of the Novo Exercito do Povo's artillery battalions, the Balau is deployed in almost every form imaginable. Defensive emplacements, self-propelled guns, anti-grav platforms, mechs, and at one point even an experimental power suit design, later designated the Dorothy. The barrels vary nearly as much, including long-barreled howitzer variants for heavier stationary designs, while a short-barreled siege mortar style predominates among mobile platforms. Chubby... Oh, damn it. Misclick. Well, let me just back up a little. The barrels vary nearly as much, including long-barreled howitzer variants for heavier stationary designs, while a short-barreled siege mortar style predominates among mobile platforms. Chubbies and stubbies, respectively. All variants feed from the same munitions, courtesy of the extraordinary restraint from the Design Bureau. The Balau's ubiquity stems from its flexibility, as the variety of barrel and mount types is matched by the variety of munitions it can fire. While HE and cluster are most commonly deployed, there also exist incendiary, fragmentation, and other variants. There's even rumors of a chemical cache within Central, but who knows what's stashed in there. Rocket Pod, 57mm HE autoload, Pitbull. The Pitbull rocket is actually a Corvid subvariant of the Shrike 57, a fin-stabilized, unguided air-to-ground munition almost as old as the colonies themselves. Shrikes were produced and stored in such volume that the Supply Corps' accounting of the munitions was quite poor, allowing Corvid sympathizers to pilfer from the stocks unnoticed. When a full inquiry examined the stores, it became apparent these supplies had been raided for years. Thus, the staple of the Corvid war machine became possible only through its adversaries' gross negligence. Unlike the Shrike, the Pitbull is neither accurate nor long-range. Corvid removed the stabilizing fins from Shrikes and cut down each into a pair of rockets half the length. The new Pitbull's payload is somewhat reduced and has significantly lower muzzle velocity, but the much larger magazine more than compensates. This, however, doesn't prevent Cavalier drivers from emptying their entire payloads within seconds. To this end, the Pitbull's withering rate of fire is a double-edged sword. Laser, 14 megawatt tri-beam, Thunderclap. The Thunderclap's colorful name derives from a more than passing resemblance to lightning. What appears as a bright blue beam is actually the ionization of oxygen from thousands of femtosecond laser pulses. A paper in the Journal of Weaponized Photonics titled Improved Efficacy of Ultrafast Pulsed Impacts Against Shielding and Carbon-Based Lifeforms made the rounds about a decade ago, but this is the first successful deployment I've seen of those outlined principles. The Thunderclap has shown to be particularly effective at both armor ablation and hard shield disruption, with poor performance against fortifications and high-density structures being the only apparent drawback. As Thunderclaps are a mainstay of Spacer forces, I suspect this explains why Jericho cannons are fielded so numerously as well. PsyOps have taken a particular interest in the weapon due to unusually high incidence of combat fatigue in theaters where it's fielded. I suspect this has to do with the particularly disturbing fashion in which the beam sublimates living tissue, most impacts leaving behind only a fine red mist and bones heavy with gristle. It is a powerful and distinctive weapon, rightly feared. Railgun, 25mm Sabo, Zeus. By far the most popular Lorentz Force weapon to ever see field deployment. Each round is cased with a superconductor coil that is charged at the time of firing, creating an intense localized magnetic field that confines the round to a micrometer wide path in the barrel. The slugs exit at supersonic speeds and can pass through entire buildings with ease. Targets in the vicinity will also be hit by an intense shockwave, requiring sensor systems to briefly recalibrate. The aptly named Zeus has a black mark in acquisitions, since its popularity with the War Council has led to unfavorable comparisons and countless pet projects getting canned before reaching prototyping. Side note, I'm a little confused. If any of you are interested in weird experimental weaponry, the idea of a Sabo railgun seems very strange to me, because it doesn't seem like the Sabo does you any favors. Unless it's just for stabilization. Because a railgun uses magnetic coils to force a ferric slug at high speed. But when you're using a Sabo, the casing breaks off very quickly after firing. But why you would... I guess it has to just be for stabilization, in theory. Of course, this is all theoretical. But you sort of lose... a railgun is inherently supposed to be for slugs because, well, one, it's a pretty violent force, at least in modern, testing applications of it. But the idea that, when the casing around a Sabo breaks off, the physics of the thing mean that casing is still traveling at the same speed as the rest of the round. So, unless I've got... gravity is gravity. It exerts the same force regardless of mass. Or the same downward acceleration regardless of mass. So you don't get a longer flight when the formerly single, Sabo round and casing, when it splits off to only be the round, you don't get any acceleration nor any longer flight. So it seems sort of pointless, but anyway, I'm speculating about weird things that don't exist, so I don't know. It's the kind of weird tech nerd shit that I find fascinating. Cannon, 140mm HE smoothbore, Bishop. The Bishop is, quite frankly, a ridiculous weapon. Essentially a short-barreled, smoothbore version of a cannon designed for frigates and larger littoral-class vessels. The combined weight of the barrel and munitions means it can only be fielded by the heaviest mobile platforms, and even then with very limited ammunition. That being said, the destructive potential of Bishop HE rounds is tremendous, and while I understand the need for such ordnance given the increasing deflective potential of modern shield emitters, this weapon should only be fielded in urban operations if there is no concern for collateral damage, which is why I find its relatively common deployment on Huss and Canmore units within Solo Nobre extremely disconcerting. The actual firing of these weapons within the perimeter walls would inflict calamitous damage. Yeah, okay. I thought I missed one. Cannon, 88mm canister, 88. Corvids are always trying to outdo each other, though it's usually a great deal of recycling with a little ingenuity on top. The 88 shares the same caliber as the Archie, but the barrel is much heavier and the breech has been reinforced to handle extra propellant load. In a pinch, an 88 can actually double as an Archie, though loading an 88 shell into an Archie, on the other hand, is a guaranteed way to mushroom the barrel. The 88's munitions are very long canister shells, packed to the gills with explosive submunitions. Just think of a giant shotgun packed with 25 explosives the size of golf balls. Hard to go wrong there. Gatling gun, 30mm, Koenig. Along with the Abbott and the Maidois, the Koenig is a design we inherited from before the colony. It's brilliant. 7 barrels, a hydraulic feed system that rarely jams, and a rate of fire that will crack hard shields and armor before a target knows what hit them. Originally deployed only on aircraft and naval vessels, Koenigs started showing up on Corvid heavies during the early days of the uprising. Somehow they'd shanghaied a warehouse stock full of them. And within months were using them to turn loyalist patrols into fine mist. The design bureaus soon did their own test fittings of the weapon, and in the years since, it's become common to see a Canmore or kettle with that 7-barrel snout jetting out the front. No matter the job, a Koenig will get it done. Chain gun, 90mm Beehive, Kraken. The Kraken takes the principle of Beehive rounds and applies it on a macro scale. Rather than packing thousands of millimeter-width flechettes into a single casing, Kraken rounds stack 8 depleted uranium rods into a sabot, set to a narrow dispersion. These simultaneous impacts inflict a tremendous shearing effect that can punch a hole in all but the hardiest armor. This extremely high muzzle velocity and set of ultra-dense projectiles also grants the Kraken excellent penetrative power, second only to Lorentz force munitions. While that velocity isn't sufficient to crack hard shields the way railgun slugs do, the weapon more than compensates through a much higher rate of fire. That's interesting. The idea of stacking multiple rounds into a single sabot. There's lots of weird weapons in the history of humanity. Stacked bullets are a thing that are not even that rare. I hadn't really considered them as a sabot, though. That's just bizarre, but it's kind of fun. Siege howitzer, 305mm FAE cluster, Harvester. There are only a few instances I can find where spacers will field old world ordnance, physical munitions. Given their prohibitive mass constraints both on and off the battlefield, spacers adhere to the energy-based weaponry both out of necessity as well as taste. However, when they do take pains to field conventional munitions, I guarantee you those weapons are to be feared and respected. The Spacer's Harvester Howitzer is a 305mm fuel-air explosive cluster munition. Rather than rely on a single large flame and pressure front, the Harvester's many warheads create dozens of miniature fronts that turbulently collide, causing concatenating chains of pressure fluctuations. These rapidly forming and collapsing pocket vacuums and their shockwaves exert forces beyond the capabilities of any known unit-tier shield emitter to deflect, and cockpits simply burst like ripe tomatoes under the strain. Those caught within the blast radius are either immolated in the blast itself, asphyxiated by lungs ruptured from rarefaction, or poisoned by the highly toxic fuel mixture. One reason among many that illustrates why spacers remain such a feared adversary. Chemical projector, 132mm by 4, Plowman. An egghead once told me what was in these canisters, but what I learned is that scientists like to get creative when naming their implements of destruction. What I can say is the mixture for each pod includes something called tuberale, real nasty stuff. Apparently it reacts violently with the byproducts of strong acids, which are packed into each pod by the dozen. The end result causes eruptions of highly corrosive gas that'll dissolve anything solid in short order. Effective, but a terrible waste of potentially good salvage. The poor guy seems so proud of what he made. War crimes are all good fun until they make you inhale. Laser, 20 megawatt focusing, Otomo. Heat has always been the lurking devil of laser development. No matter how efficient your systems are, some amount of killing power invariably stays in the weapon. With the Otomo, spacer engineers have achieved an incredibly elegant solution to that problem, though it still barely accommodates the stresses heavy mount weapon systems sustain. As current is drawn through the active material, heat within the optical cavity is accumulated at the emission window, a metamaterial with a phenomenal photon-assisted stimulated emission process. The result is a beam of incredible power, but also one of staggering energy consumption. Another downside operators must account for is that while the cavity is warming to operating temperature, the beam is extremely unfocused. Errant beams can fire as wide as 30 meters off target during this window, and as a result, it's not uncommon to see massive scorch cones enveloping primary impact points. Spacers don't seem to mind this drawback or the short range. If anything, they revel in it. This, I believe, is the weapon that was absolutely destroying me at every turn in that third to last mission, the F1. Lots of large mechs with those strapped to them. And finally, Laser 18 megawatt pulsed Chieftain. A pulsed laser system that outputs a multiplex of high frequency modes, all designed to overload shield emitters. Of course, it's also very harmful to solid matter, but when spacers are involved, that's generally a given. The spacer design teams seem to have problems getting the optics to handle the load, as the beam scatters with continued use. Excellent in short bursts, but maintaining any kind of sustained fire degrades accuracy so severely it's impractical to do so, even at short range. The capacity for an unreasonably high cycling rate is retained on the system, however, as I suspect even spacers enjoy a game of chance from time to time. While very effective, the cost of maintenance alone is astronomical, making this weapon as much a showpiece as a war implement, a metaphor for the spacers if there ever was one. And that's the end of that. We went through every pilot, every vehicle, every bit of equipment. The operations don't have anything. There's just intel, all the intel, and the lore. That's it. That's Brigador. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back with something different next time.